So the next section looks at passages in the New Testament that fit the criteria of embarrassment. Scholars note that if a passage is embarrassing to the author who wrote it, it is likely to be true, since the author would have preferred the event had never happened, yet feel the need to report it anyway. And in fact, when we look at the New Testament, we can point to dozens of examples, like how Acts and 1 Corinthians report challenges the early church faced and wrestled with. The fact the New Testament writers mention these disputes testifies to the probability that they actually happened. Now, some disagree with this and claim that the existence of embarrassing passages doesn't make something true. Well, obviously, no one claimed that just because something is embarrassing for the original author, it is automatically true. The criteria of embarrassment adds evidence something is more likely true. But of course, if there is stronger evidence favoring its falsehood, then the embarrassment factor is outweighed. Yet that doesn't mean the criteria of embarrassment should be completely disregarded, as historians still consider it a valid tool to use in our cumulative investigation of history. Sometimes embarrassing passages can be created for moral or theological reasons. Like for example in Romans 7, Paul speaks of his inability to do the good. A skeptic can point out that even though this passage seems embarrassing, it is used for theological teachings and has a purpose. So it could have been invented for that specific purpose. So what we need to ask is if there are sections of the New Testament that are embarrassing and have little to no theological significance. And in fact, we can point to many places, like the example we just spoke about. If you're inventing theology that Christians don't need to be circumcised, it would be far easier to just invent a saying of Jesus on this. Instead of claiming the church split over the issue, a council had to be called, and they had to hack out their differences. This is much more embarrassing than simply saying you were enlightened by the Holy Spirit on the issue. The same can be applied to the issues the Corinthian church faced. Also in the Gospels, there doesn't seem to be a good reason to make up the fact that Jesus was buried in the tomb of a Sanhedrin member. For the early church, the Sanhedrin was corrupt, had unjustly crucified their Messiah, and was the enemy of the early church. To admit they could not supply their own tomb for Jesus, and had to use a tomb of a group who hated and persecuted them, is an unlikely invention that doesn't have much to teach, outside of the possibility the author is just reporting history as it happened. The Gospels also give a prominent role to the women followers of Jesus. In the modern world, such a thing would hardly be questioned, but to ancient people, women were considered untrustworthy. The Talmud says, any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer. Yet all four Gospels report the women were the first to discover the empty tomb. If this was an invention, it would not have helped the early Christians theologically in any way, since the testimony of women was not trusted, and Christian opponents like Celsus used this fact against them. This embarrassing fact was not something you'd invent for any reason. As N.T. Wright says, as historians we are obliged to comment that if these stories had been made up 5 years later, let alone 30, 40, or 50 years later, they would never have had Mary Magdalene in this role. To put Mary there is, from the point of view of Christian apologists wanting to explain to a skeptical audience that Jesus really did rise from the dead, like shooting themselves in the foot. But to us as historians, this kind of thing is gold dust. The early Christians would never have made this up. In fact, there are several instances we can look at that fit the criteria of embarrassment. The fact that the New Testament writers mention things that are embarrassing supports the idea they were reporting history as it happened, instead of making up stories to suit their needs.